Okay, in this lecture, we're going to take a look at an example of a component that uses a service to make calls to the backend. So in the services folder, open up to-dos component. So this is a simplified implementation of a to-dos component. In ngOnInit method, we initialize the to-dos property by calling the server and getting the list of to-do items. We also have an add method and a delete method. Now in this lecture, we're going to focus only on ngOnInit. So what should we test here? Let's see what's happening in this method. We're calling service.getToDos method, which returns an observable. We subscribe to the observable and then initialize the to-dos property. So in our unit test, we want to call this method ngOnInit, and then we want to assert that the to-dos property is initialized. However, we're not going to use this service here because this service is going to make calls to the backend, and this is against the definition of a unit test. Because in unit tests, we don't want to touch the file system or a database or call backend services. We want to isolate a component from external resources. So in our unit test, we're going to give this component a fake service. This service is not going to make backend calls. It's just going to return a simple observable. So let's go ahead and do it. Open up our spec file. First, I'm going to declare our service here, to-do service. Now let's initialize it, service, to a new instance of to-do service. Now here in the constructor, we need to pass an instance of the HTTP service in Angular. I'm not going to import this class here because the constructor of this class would require additional arguments. So it's going to make our test setup very complicated. So I'm just going to cheat here and pass null. And it doesn't really matter because we're not going to use that HTTP service anyway. I'm going to change the implementation of getToDos method in this service. You're going to see that in a second. So here's our service. And now let's initialize our component, new to-dos component, and pass the service here. Now there is also another approach in unit testing components that use services. So instead of giving this component a real instance of the to-do service, we give it a fake implementation, which we call a stub. I'm going to show you how to do that in the next section. So here's our before each function. Now let's write the test. So this component should set to-dos property with the items returned from the server. All right, now let's start with the arrange part. We want to change the implementation of the getToDos method. To do that, we use a function in Jasmine called spy on. With this function, we can put a spy on a method in a class. And with that spy, we can check if that method has been called. We can change the implementation of that method. We can return a different value, or we can throw an error. So basically, with a spy, we get control over a method in a class. Now here, the first argument is the object we want to put a spy on. That is our service. And the second argument is the name of the method in that object. So get to-dos. Now dot and call fake. With this, we can change the implementation of getToDos method. Let's have a quick look at the implementation of this method. Look, getToDos is a method with no parameters that returns an observable. So here we need to pass a function with the exact same signature. The parameterless method goes to, and here's the body of our fake method. So here we want to return an observable. Let's go on the top and import observable from rxjs/observable. I'm also going to import rxjs add observable from. With this, we can create an observable from an array. Now here we need to simulate the response that is returned from the server. The server will return an array of to-do items. So here we need to add another array that includes one or more to-do items. We can use simple numbers here, and that's perfectly fine for this test because we're not going to test anything specific to to-do items. Or if you don't like this, you can add real to-do objects here. ID 1, title A, and then duplicate and change accordingly, like this. But this is just going to add extra noise to our test, and it doesn't add any value. So I would rather to revert this back to simple numbers. 1, 2, 3. So with this, when we call service.getToDos, this function is going to be called. This is going to replace the real implementation. Okay? So here's our arrange part. Now let's act. So component.ng on init. And now let's assert. Expect component.todos.length to be greater than 0. That's one way to write this expectation. It's a little bit more general. We can be a little bit more specific. So we can write it like this. We expect the length to be 3 because we are returning exactly 3 to the items from the server. We can also make it a little bit more specific. So we want to make sure that what we have here in this property is exactly what we get from the server. So here I can declare a variable, call it todos, and set it to this array that we return from the server. And then we can change our assertion. So we expect this todos to be this array here. Let's test it. Okay, beautiful. All our tests are passing. Now, if the concept of spies is new to you, don't worry. We're going to look at more examples in the next lecture.